Welcome to Washington Today for December 19th, 2022. I'm Gary Sterikoff. Thanks a lot for joining us. Here are some of today's headlines. The House committee investigating the January 6th, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol held its final public meeting today and, in an unprecedented move, voted unanimously to recommend federal criminal charges against former President Donald Trump. The hearing featured the initial release of the committee's final report, which followed an 18-month investigation that included testimony from former Trump White House staffers, court records, and access to some of the most sensitive papers held by the Trump administration. Also in the report, a recommendation for a formal ethics inquiry into four House Republicans for their actions in the lead-up to and the aftermath of the attack, including Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Jim Jordan of Ohio, Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, and Andy Biggs of Arizona. Those were also the four men who refused to comply with the committee's subpoenas after declining invitations to appear before the panel. We'll have complete coverage from today's hearing coming up. Meanwhile, jury selection in the seditious conspiracy case against former Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio and four others charged in the attack on the U.S. Capitol began today. Defense attorneys pushed to postpone the process because of evidence they say that might be in the January 6th committee report, along with media coverage that could taint the jury pool. That request was denied by U.S. District Judge Timothy Kelly. Enrique Tarrio, Ethan Nordine, Zachary Rail, Dominic Pezzola, and Joseph Biggs face seditious conspiracy and other charges in connection with the January 6th attack on the Capitol. If convicted, they could face up to 20 years in prison. The trial is expected to last at least 6 weeks. Congress returns today, and lawmakers face a deadline to fund the government through next year to avert a shutdown. Current money runs out this coming Friday at midnight. The Senate plans to take up the spending package first, with Senate Appropriations Committee Chair Patrick Leahy announcing last week that negotiators had reached a bipartisan agreement. The specifics of that deal, however, remain unknown. And The Hill today writing that the funding bill will likely still see opposition in both chambers, as several Republicans are calling for another short-term funding measure that would extend the funding deadline to sometime next year. It would also allow the new House Republican majority to have more say in government spending for the remainder of the fiscal year. The Supreme Court announced today that the date that it will consider two major challenges to the Biden administration student loan forgiveness plan. That date is February 28th. Last week, the justices decided to take up a second challenge to the program. That case claims the Education Department implemented the plan without proper public notification or input. That joins another suit that involves a challenge brought by 6 states that claims the plan exceeds the president's authority. We begin on Capitol Hill, where the House committee investigating the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol held its final public meeting today and voted unanimously to recommend federal criminal charges against former President Trump and others. The hearing featured the initial release of the committee's final report, which followed an 18-month investigation that included testimony from former Trump White House staffers, court records, and access to some of the most sensitive records held by the Trump administration. The committee also recommending a formal ethics inquiry into 4 Republican members of the House for their actions in the lead-up to and the aftermath of the attack. That list includes Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy of California, Jim Jordan of Ohio, Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, and Andy Biggs of Arizona. Of course, those were the 4 men who refused to comply with committee subpoenas after declining invitations to appear before the panel. Here's committee member Jamie Raskin of Maryland outlining the committee's criminal referrals.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, our committee had the opportunity last spring to present much of our evidence to a federal judge, something that distinguishes our investigation from any other congressional investigation I can recall. In the context of resolving evidentiary privilege issues related to the crime-fraud doctrine in the Eastman case, U.S. District Court Judge David Carter examined just a small subset of our evidence to determine whether it showed the likely commission of a federal offense. The judge concluded that both former President Donald Trump and John Eastman likely violated 2 federal criminal statutes. This is the starting point for our analysis today. The first criminal statute we invoke for referral, therefore, is Title 18, Section 1512C, which makes it unlawful for anyone to corruptly obstruct, influence, or impede any official proceeding of the United States government. We believe that the evidence described by my colleagues today and assembled throughout our hearings warrants a criminal referral of former President Donald J. Trump, John Eastman, and others for violations of this statute. The whole purpose and obvious effect of Trump's scheme were to obstruct, influence, and impede this official proceeding, the central moment for the lawful transfer of power in the United States. Second, we believe that there is more than sufficient evidence to refer former President Donald J. Trump, John Eastman, and others for violating Title 18, Section 371. This statute makes it a crime to conspire to defraud the United States. In other words, to make an agreement to impair, obstruct, or defeat the lawful functions of the United States government by deceitful or dishonest means. Former President Trump did not engage in a plan to defraud the United States acting alone. He entered into agreements, formal and informal, with several other individuals who assisted him with his criminal objectives. Our report describes in detail the actions of numerous co-conspirators who agreed with and participated in Trump's plan to impair, obstruct, and defeat the certification of President Biden's electoral victory. That said, the subcommittee does not attempt to determine all of the potential participants in this conspiracy, as our understanding of the role of many individuals may be incomplete even today because they refuse to answer our questions. We trust that the Department of Justice will be able to form a far more complete picture through its own investigation. Third, we make a referral based on Title 18, Section 1001, which makes it unlawful to knowingly and willfully make materially false statements to the federal government. The evidence clearly suggests that President Trump conspired with others to submit slates of fake electors to Congress and the National Archives. We believe that this evidence we set forth in our report is more than sufficient for a criminal referral of former President Donald J. Trump and others in connection with this offense. As before, we don't try to determine all of the participants in this conspiracy, many of whom refuse to answer our questions while under oath. We trust that the Department of Justice will be able to form a more complete picture through its own investigation. The fourth and final statute we invoke for referral is Title 18, Section 2383. The statute applies to anyone who incites, assists, or engages in insurrection against the United States of America, and anyone who gives aid or comfort to an insurrection. An insurrection is a rebellion against the authority of the United States. It is a grave federal offense anchored in the Constitution itself, which repeatedly opposes insurrections and domestic violence, and indeed uses participation in insurrection by office holders as automatic grounds for disqualification from ever holding public office again at the federal or state level. Anyone who incites others to engage in rebelling, assists them in doing so, or gives aid and comfort to those engaged in insurrection is guilty of a federal crime. The committee believes that more than sufficient evidence exists for a criminal referral of former President Trump for assisting or aiding and comforting those at the Capitol who engaged in a violent attack on the United States. The committee has developed significant evidence that President Trump intended to disrupt the peaceful transition of power under our Constitution. The President has an affirmative and primary constitutional duty to act to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Nothing could be a greater betrayal of this duty than to assist in insurrection against the constitutional order. The complete factual basis for this referral is set forth in detail throughout our report. These are not the only statutes that are potentially relevant to President Trump's conduct related to the 2020 election. Depending on evidence developed by the Department of Justice, the president's actions could certainly trigger other criminal violations. Nor are President Trump and his immediate team the only people identified for referrals in our report. As part of our investigation, we asked multiple members of Congress to speak with us about issues critical to our understanding of this attack on the 2020 election and our system of constitutional democracy. None agreed to provide that essential information. As a result, we took the significant step of issuing them subpoenas based on the volume of information particular members possessed about one or more parts of President Trump's plans to overturn the election. None of the subpoenaed members complied, and we are now referring 4 members of Congress for appropriate sanction by the House Ethics Committee for failure to comply with lawful subpoenas. Mr. Chairman, we understand the gravity of each and every referral we are making today, just as we understand the magnitude of the crime against democracy that we describe in our report. But we have gone where the facts and the law lead us, and inescapably, they lead us here. Accordingly, Mr. Chairman, in light of these facts, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be directed to transmit to the United States Department of Justice relevant Select Committee records in furtherance of these criminal referrals.
House January 6th Committee member Jamie Raskin outlining the committee's recommendations on former President Trump and others. Now, later, he and committee member Adam Schiff of California talked to the press more about the referral process.
How quickly does the committee plan to provide this raw material to the Justice Department? And do you have plans to brief this special counsel about what you found, or has that process been ongoing?
Well, we just adopted the motion to have the chairman send this over, so I imagine it will happen quickly. We just have a few more days in business, so certainly it will happen this week.
Have you been in contact with the special counsel so far up to this point?
Not personally, I have not been, but
Mr. Schiff, have you?
The chair would undoubtedly. Oh, please.
No, I don't think individual members have, but our staff has been in contact with the Justice Department throughout the process. Obviously, they've made requests along the way, but we expect that the evidence will be, I think, beginning Wednesday, made available with exhibits, transcripts to the public, as well as the Justice Department.
Representative Schiff also talked about the ethics inquiry referrals.
Representative, can I ask about members of Congress? You guys referred 4 members of Congress, including Kevin McCarthy, to the Ethics Committee. There's been a number of Republican lawmakers that you've mentioned throughout your investigation. Why only these 4, and why was Mo Brooks not included in that list?
Well, the focus of the referrals to the Ethics Committee was essentially placed on their contempt of the committee, contempt of Congress, and failing to show up when they received lawful subpoenas. We did not choose to make referrals based on the underlying conduct, but rather on the essentially open and shut failure to comply with the congressional subpoena.
But you did suggest the Justice Department could potentially bring them in with the grand jury subpoena. Was that, talk about the intent behind that?
Well, and this is a broader point that we're trying to make, which is we obviously subpoenaed a number of witnesses, not just members of Congress, who in one way or another refused to comply with the subpoenas. Or they asserted privileges that plainly don't apply, but it would have taken us years to litigate to try to defeat the assertion of those privileges. The Justice Department can move much more quickly. They have the ability to enforce their subpoenas. Our subpoenas, we had to go hat in hand to the Justice Department, and we were batting about 50% when we made a criminal referral for contempt in terms of what the department would prosecute. So they can move more swiftly. It appears, based on public reports, they have moved more swiftly. They have been able to obtain testimony from people who refused to cooperate with us. Now, none of us know exactly what the character of that testimony is and whether witnesses in that testimony asserted privileges that the Justice Department will also have to litigate. But the long and the short of it is we possess evidence that up until this release, the Justice Department may not have. They possess evidence that we don't have, and the cumulative impact of all that evidence will hopefully lead to justice for those that have broken the law here.
House January 6th Committee member Adam Schiff, and Politico writing that the committee report describes in detail how former President Trump pressured staffers and local elected officials to help him overturn the 2020 election results while knowing that many of his schemes could be illegal. Here's Committee Chair Benny Thompson of Mississippi.
To cast a vote in the United States is an act of faith and hope. When we drop that ballot in the ballot box, we expect the people named on the ballot are going to uphold their end of the deal. The winner swears an oath and upholds it. Those who come up short ultimately accept the results and abide by the rule of law. That faith in our system is the foundation of American democracy. If the faith is broken, so is our democracy. Donald Trump broke that faith. He lost the 2020 election and knew it. But he chose to try to stay in office through a multi-part scheme to overturn the results and block the transfer of power. In the end, he summoned a mob to Washington, and knowingly they were armed and angry, pointed them to the Capitol and told them to fight like hell. There's no doubt about this. This afternoon, my colleagues will present our key findings, reminding you of some of the information we presented in earlier hearings and telling you how it fits in our broader conclusions. Those conclusions have helped shape the committee's final report, which we'll adopt today pursuant to House Resolution 503, which establishes the Select Committee nearly a year and a half ago. I expect our final work will be filed with the Clerk of the House and made public later this week. Beyond that release, the Select Committee intends to make public the bulk of its non-sensitive records before the end of the year. These transcripts and documents will allow the American people to see for themselves the body of evidence we've gathered and continue to explore the information that has led us to our conclusions. This committee is nearing the end of its work, but as the country, we remain in strange and uncharted waters. We've never had a president of the United States stir up a violent attempt to block the transfer of power. I believe nearly 2 years later, this is still a time of reflection and reckoning. If we are to survive as a nation of laws and democracy, this can never happen again. How do we stop it? This committee will lay out a number of recommendations in its final report, but beyond any specific details and recommendations we present, there's one factor I believe is most important in preventing another January 6th, accountability. So today, beyond our findings, we will also show that evidence we've gathered points to further action beyond the power of this committee or the Congress to help ensure accountability under law. Accountability that can only be found in the criminal justice system. We have every confidence that the work of this committee will help provide a roadmap to justice, and that the agencies and institutions responsible for ensuring justice under the law will use the information we've provided to aid in their work. And for those of you who have followed this committee's work, I hope we've helped make clear that there's a broader kind of accountability. Accountability to all of you, the American people. The future of our democracy rests in your hands. It's up to the people of this country to decide who deserves the public trust, who will put fidelity to the Constitution and democracy above all else, who will abide by the rule of law, no matter the outcome. I'm grateful to the millions of you who followed this committee's work. I hope we lived up to our commitment to present the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. Let me say in closing, the women and men seated around me on this dais are public servants in the most genuine sense. They put aside politics and partisanship to ensure the success of this committee in providing answers to the American people. I especially want to thank and acknowledge our Vice Chair, who has become a true partner in this bipartisan effort, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming.
House January 6th Committee Chair Benny Thompson at today's hearing. And according to The Hill, in addition to the committee's federal criminal charge referral, the summary also outlines possible witness tampering with its investigation. Here's Committee Chair Liz Cheney of Wyoming.
In April of 1861, when Abraham Lincoln issued the first call for volunteers for the Union Army, my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Fletcher Cheney, joined the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He fought through all 4 years of the Civil War, from Chickamauga to Stones River to Atlanta. He marched with his unit in the Grand Review of Troops up Pennsylvania Avenue in May of 1865, past a reviewing stand where President Johnson and General Grant were seated. Silas Canfield, the regimental historian of the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry, described the men in the unit this way. He said they had a just appreciation of the value and advantage of free government and the necessity of defending and maintaining it. And they enlisted, prepared to accept all the necessary labors, fatigues, exposures, dangers, and even death for the unity of our nation and the perpetuity of our institutions. I have found myself thinking often, especially since January 6th, of my great-great-grandfather and all those in every generation who have sacrificed so much for the unity of our nation and the perpetuity of our institutions. At the heart of our republic is the guarantee of the peaceful transfer of power. Members of Congress are reminded of this every day as we pass through the Capitol Rotunda. There, 8 magnificent paintings detail the earliest days of our republic. One, painted by John Trumbull, depicts the moment in 1793 when George Washington resigned his commission, handing control of the Continental Army back to Congress. Trumbull called this, quote, one of the highest moral lessons ever given the world. With this noble act, George Washington established the indispensable example of the peaceful transfer of power in our nation. Standing on the west front of the Capitol in 1981, President Ronald Reagan described it this way: the orderly transfer of authority as called for in the Constitution routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony that we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle. Every president in our history has defended this orderly transfer of authority, except one. January 6, 2021 was the first time one American president refused his constitutional duty to transfer power peacefully to the next. In our work over the last 18 months, the Select Committee has recognized our obligation to do everything we can to ensure this never happens again. At the beginning of our investigation, we understood that tens of millions of Americans had been persuaded by President Trump that the 2020 election was stolen by overwhelming fraud. And we also knew this was flatly false. We knew that dozens of state and federal judges had addressed and resolved all manner of allegations about the election. Our legal system functioned as it should, but our president would not accept the outcome. Among the most shameful of this committee's findings was that President Trump sat in the dining room off the Oval Office, watching the violent riot at the Capitol on television. For hours, he would not issue a public statement instructing his supporters to disperse and leave the Capitol, despite urgent pleas from his White House staff and dozens of others to do so. Members of his family, his White House lawyers, virtually all those around him knew that this simple act was critical. For hours, he would not do it. During this time, law enforcement agents were attacked and seriously injured. The Capitol was invaded, the electoral count was halted, and the lives of those in the Capitol were put at risk. In addition to being unlawful as described in our report, this was an utter moral failure and a clear dereliction of duty. Evidence of this can be seen in the testimony of President Trump's own White House counsel and several other White House witnesses. No man who would behave that way at that moment in time can ever serve in any position of authority in our nation again. He is unfit for any office. The committee recognizes that our work has only begun. It's only the initial step in addressing President Trump's effort to remain in office illegally. Prosecutors are considering the implications of the conduct that we describe in our report, as are citizens all across our nation. In 1761, John Adams wrote, "The very ground of our liberties is the freedom of elections." Faith in our elections and the rule of law is paramount to our republic. Election deniers, those who refuse to accept lawful election results, purposely attack the rule of law and the foundation of our country. The history of our time will show that the bravery of a handful of Americans doing their duty saved us from an even more grave constitutional crisis. Elected officials, election workers, and public servants stood against Donald Trump's corrupt pressure. Many of our committee's witnesses showed selfless patriotism, and their words and courage will be remembered. The brave men and women of the Capitol Police, the Metropolitan Police, and all the other law enforcement officers who fought to defend us that day saved lives and our democracy. Finally, I wish to thank my colleagues on this committee. It has been a tremendous honor to serve with all of you. We have accomplished great and important things together, and I hope we have set an example. And I also want to thank all of those who have honorably contributed to the work of our committee and to our report. We have accomplished much over a short period of time. Many of you sacrificed for the good of our nation. You have helped make history, and I hope helped to right the ship.
House January 6th Committee Vice Chair Liz Cheney at today's final hearing. You're listening to Washington Today. Welcome back to Washington Today. We'll have more coverage from today's House January 6th Committee hearing coming up. But first, more of today's headlines. U.S. Capitol Police Officer Caroline Edwards said in a new op-ed that it, quote, physically hurts to talk about the Capitol riot, adding that the House January 6th Committee issuing its report this week represents, in her words, nothing final. Officer Edwards, who was injured in the attack last year and testified before the committee this summer, said in the New York Times that it could take years for her and other officers to find peace after being traumatized during the riot. The Biden administration is proposing a new federal rule that would effectively phase out compact fluorescent light bulbs in favor of more energy-efficient LED bulbs. The rule would more than double the current light bulb efficiency level. White House National Climate Advisor Ali Zaidi told CNN that the move will save money for American consumers and that LED lighting technology has improved tremendously over the years, providing better light at a fraction of the cost. According to the Department of Energy, LED bulbs can last 3 to 5 times longer than a compact fluorescent bulb and up to 30 times longer than an incandescent bulb. LEDs release very little heat and thus waste less energy. And President Biden and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden will host a Hanukkah celebration tonight at the White House. The event will include a reception with Jewish leaders and a menorah lighting. Tonight is the second night of the holiday. The president will also deliver remarks in which he will argue that, quote, silence is complicity in the face of a rise in anti-Semitism in the U.S. and that religious hate and violence have no place in America. The House January 6th Committee held its final hearing today, recommending federal criminal charges on former President Donald Trump. Those are obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to make a false statement, incite or assist or aid and comfort an insurrection. The committee also recommended a formal ethics inquiry into House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and 3 other House Republicans, Jim Jordan of Ohio, Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, and Andy Biggs of Arizona, for their actions in the lead-up to and in the aftermath of the attack. And today's final meeting comes on the 2-year anniversary of the former president's December 19, 2020 tweet, in which he urged supporters to come to Washington for a, quote, wild protest, a fact that committee member Stephanie Murphy of Florida noted in her statement.
2 years ago today, in the early morning hours of December 19th, Donald Trump sent a tweet urging his supporters to travel to Washington for a protest on January 6th. "Be there, we'll be wild," he tweeted. Between December 19th and January 6th, the president repeatedly encouraged his supporters to come to Washington. The president's December 19th tweet galvanized domestic violent extremists, including members of the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and organized militia groups. These individuals began organizing to come to the Capitol in large numbers with the specific intent to use violence to disrupt the certification of the election during the joint session. Prior to January 6th, the FBI, Secret Service, U.S. Capitol Police, D.C. government, and other law enforcement agencies gathered substantial evidence suggesting the risk of violence at the Capitol during the joint session. These included warnings like the following. Their plan is to literally kill people. Please take this tip seriously and investigate further. President Trump supporters have proposed a movement to occupy Capitol Hill. Alert regarding the VP being a dead man walking if he doesn't do the right thing. I saw several other alerts saying they will storm the Capitol if he doesn't do the right thing. In the days leading up to January 6th, President Trump's advisors explicitly told him that he should encourage his supporters to be peaceful that day, but he refused. One witness, Hope Hicks, provided the committee with records of her text messages on January 6th. In one exchange with another staffer, he texted her, "Hey, I know you're seeing this, but he," referring to President Trump, "really should tweet something about being nonviolent." "I'm not there," Hicks replied. "I suggested it several times Monday and Tuesday, and he refused." When Ms. Hicks came in to provide testimony to the committee, we asked her about this exchange. Her explanation is that the he in this text wasn't the president, but rather it was Eric Hirschman. Take a listen to her testimony.
When you wrote, "I suggested it several times," and it presumably means that the president say something about being nonviolent. You wrote, "I suggested it several times Monday and Tuesday, and he refused." Tell us what happened.
Sure. I didn't speak to the president about this directly, but I communicated people like Eric Hirschman that it was my view that it was important that the president put out some kind of message in advance of the event.
And what was Mr. Hirschman's response?
Mr. Hirschman said that he had made the same, recommendation directly to the president, and that he had refused.
Just so I understand, Mr. Hirschman said that he had already recommended to the president that the president convey a message that people should be peaceful on January 6th, and the president had refused to do that?
Yes.
The public will be able to review this in the transcripts and see the perspective Eric Hirschman gave before we took Hope Hicks's testimony. Despite having knowledge of the threats of violence presented by the crowd gathered on January 6th, President Trump gave an incendiary speech, declaring without basis that the election had been stolen and encouraging his supporters to fight like hell. And during the speech and immediately thereafter, President Trump stated his intention to travel to the Capitol with his supporters in an effort to influence the joint session. The Select Committee has developed evidence indicating that President Trump did, in fact, intend to go to the Capitol on the afternoon of January 6th, and that he repeatedly expressed that intention during the afternoon and in the days prior. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
House January 6 Committee member Stephanie Murphy from today's hearing. The committee outlined 17 findings from its investigation that it says justify criminal referrals, writing it in its report, quote, President Trump's decision to declare victory falsely on election night and unlawfully to call for the vote counting to stop was not a spontaneous decision. It was premeditated. With more, here's committee member Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Certainly one of the many important components of our federal government is the Department of Justice. It's the body that it's responsible for enforcing our laws and investigating criminal wrongdoing. For this reason, it's of the utmost importance that our Department of Justice operates as a fair and neutral body that enforces our federal laws without fear or without favor. It is this critical function that President Trump sought to corrupt, as he sought to use the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute purported election fraud and to help him convince the public that the election was stolen. The Select Committee has made the following findings with respect to the Department of Justice. In the weeks immediately following the 2020 election, Attorney General Bill Barr advised President Trump that the Department of Justice had not seen any evidence to support Trump's theory that the election was stolen by fraud. No evidence. Over the course of the 3 meetings in this post-election period, Attorney General Barr assured President Trump that the Justice Department was properly investigating claims of election fraud. He debunked numerous election fraud claims, many of which the president would then go on to repeat publicly. And he made clear that President Trump was doing, quote, a great disservice to the country by pursuing them. After Attorney General Barr's resignation, President Trump requested that the acting leadership of the department, Jeffrey Rosen and Richard Donahue, quote, just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressmen. In other words, just tell a small lie to put the facade of legitimacy on this lie, and the Republican congressmen and I can distort and destroy and create doubt all ourselves. Between December 23rd and January 3rd, President Trump called or met with them nearly every day and was told repeatedly the department investigation showed no factual support for Trump's fraud allegations. Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue told him that the fraud claims were simply untrue. As Mr. Rosen and Mr. Donahue continued to resist, President Trump then tried to install a loyalist named Jeffrey Clark to lead the department as acting Attorney General. On several occasions, Clark met with the president, apparently along with Representative Scott Perry, without authorization, promising to take the actions that Barr, Rosen, and Donahue had refused to take. In particular, Mr. Clark intended to send a letter that he had drafted with the help of a political appointee that the White House installed at DOJ with just weeks left in the administration. Mr. Clark intended to send the letter to officials in numerous states, informing them falsely, of course, that the department had identified significant concerns about the election results in their state.
House January 6 Committee member Adam Kinzinger. And you can find all of our January 6 coverage, including every hearing held by the House January 6 Committee at cspan.org/January 6. And finally today, U.S. Capitol Police Chief Thomas Manger testified on threats to Congress and the security of lawmakers at a hearing before the Senate Rules and Administration Committee. Chief Manger said that the department saw more than 9,000 threats against members of Congress over the past year. That compares to 1,000 threats in 2017. Here's Q&A between Committee Ranking Member Roy Blunt and Chief Manger.
Chief, on the recommendations that we made after January the 6th, I think you've completed about 75% of those. It's also my impression that you may need more funding or more authority or both to really address the remaining numbers. Is that correct?
The authority, not as much. That was provided, and that has been working fine. In terms of the funding, what we've done in the past year or so has addressed the security here at the Capitol. And then what we really have to focus on now are the threats against members. And that's not only addressing the threats while you are here in the Capitol, but when you're in your home districts as well. Those protection responsibilities will require additional resources, and we've got in our FY23 budget, for instance, there are a number of requests for additional positions that address the protection responsibilities that where we really need to focus.
U.S. Capitol Police Chief Tom Manger speaking earlier today at a Senate Rules and Administration Committee hearing. The whole hearing is available at cspan.org. A reminder, you can find this program as a podcast at cspan.org/podcasts. It's also on our C-SPAN Now mobile app or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like more on the stories that are shaping Washington, subscribe to our evening newsletter, word for word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.